Annihilate mob pack after mob pack with a reassuring pop.
Can't do this just yet.
Absolutely annihilate Cyrus. Upset the Trial Master so badly that he wishes to become a priest. Kill everything in tier 16s without breaking a sweat. Absolutely destroy the endgame while remaining practically invincible. If you like the sound of this, then this build is for you. Hello everyone, come in, take a seat, and let's get started. You're watching Altec 2K Gaming. Offensively, this build is pretty strong, doing a very respectable DPS number. Its bleed alone is well over 1.4 million, and it's capable of destroying absolutely anything the endgame has to throw at us. Now, if you change my weapon out of the path of building, you will notice the damage drop massively, and that's because the weapon's been edited to fix some things that aren't working properly in path of building. One of them is the 110% more damage from bleeding, and the second is the new bleeding modifier on the bleeding axes doesn't work unless you take out the bit of text that says inflicted with this weapon. The build primarily does bleeding damage, powered by BladeStorm. BladeStorm was modified this league to do up to 108% increased damage with bleeding while in Bloodstance, which we are all the time. We also utilise Corrupting Fever so that we can put up to 10 Corrupted Blood stacks on each enemy. These enemies will have this on pretty much all the time, with up to 8 normal bleeds because we utilise the Crimson Dance Keystone. Now, whilst we do a load of damage, this doesn't mean that we don't particularly tank very well. This build has a lot of armour, it reaches max block for both spells and attacks, as well as having a really strong Molten Shell for extra armour when it needs it. In addition to this, we use Enduring Cry on our left mouse button to give us health as we're walking around, and those lovely endurance charges which gives us physical damage reduction. Depending on how much currency you shell out for this build, we can also add a very nice 250 extra life each time we block. Moving on to the mechanics of the build now, which are really simple. We hit our Corrupting Fever, we drop a totem, we jump into the middle of a pack, and we fire one BladeStorm. The pack then goes pop. In the event that there's a load of rares in there, drop 1 or 2 and they'll still go pop. For bosses, we're going to drop the BladeStorms in a triangle around them to keep them pushed into the centre. This keeps them stuck between each of the BladeStorms, taking lots and lots of bleed damage as each of the BladeStorms procs. Because we leech mana, we can infinitely spam this to create an awful lot of damage from bleed. And we rinse and repeat, it's as simple as that. This build can either be extremely cheap, where we can take it all the way to tier 16s with an investment of slightly less than 20 chaos. If you do want to take it to the extreme, then you can spend an awful lot of exalts on a number of things, which we'll go over as we go through the build. My version of this build is currently valued at around 12 exalts, but you really don't need any of this expense in order to get to red maps, and that's the important thing to remember with this build. For our main skill, we utilise BladeStorm, Link to Brutality, Melee Fizz, Chance to Bleed, Ruthless, and Deadly Ailments. Because we use an Axe and Shield for this, these are all in our chest piece, which must be 6-linked. If you only have a 5-link when you start playing this, then I would drop Ruthless temporarily. For the Ascendancy, we go Gladiator. For our first Ascendancy, we get Blood in the Eyes, which gives us a 50% chance to cause bleeding with attacks. Attacks also maim on hits against bleeding enemies, have a 25% chance to blind with hits against bleeding enemies, and enemies maimed by us take 10% increased physical damage. For our second Ascendancy, we go Gratuitous Violence. This causes enemies that are bleeding that we kill to explode, dealing 10% of their maximum life as physical damage to everything around them in a big explosion. This is what causes all of the packs we jump into and do one BladeStorm to pop, because all of them are exploding at once, killing everything around them. It also gives us 20% more physical damage over time, which is very powerful for both our bleed and for our Corrupting Fever. For our third Ascendancy, we go Painforged. This causes us to be block capped if we've taken damage from a hit recently. In addition, it prevents us from being stunned when we block an attack. It also causes our counterattacks to deal double damage. Now, we only use a counterattack if you use the expensive shield, but every little helps. And our last slot is Versatile Combatant. This is an extremely strong node that makes our magic block the same as our attack block, giving us an awful lot of defences that we wouldn't have otherwise. If you do want to go all out damage and sacrifice this great defence, then you can go for Violent Retaliation, which would give us a lot more damage and more block chance. But as we already reached cap, the more block is completely pointless. On to the passive tree now, and this build is defined by 3 keystones. The first is Crimson Dance, which allows us to do 8 bleeds rather than just the 1 at a time. We then have Call to Arms, which allows us to use Enduring Cry while moving without having to stop, because it turns all war cries to instant war cries. And last but not least is Resolute Technique. This prevents enemies from evading our attacks, meaning we hit 100% of the time unless they dodge. We start off from the Duelist node, we come down through here up to get this block, round through these block nodes, down through this life, get these block nodes, and then we head up here, up the side, grab the axe nodes, grab Vanquisher for 40% increased physical damage, and we also map through 2 points here to get 12% physical damage over time multiplier. We also grab the Scion Life Wheel, and then come up to Veteran Soldier, which gives us 10% physical damage over time multiplier. Also gives us some nice life and physical damage. We grab these nodes here to grant us endurance charges, and we also have 3 jewel slots on the tree. We have this one here just below the duelist, and this one over here just across from the axe nodes. These jewels are all set to give us 6 to maximum life, and then on top of that we go for damage to axes, any melee damage, anything that's going to boost our damage really. Now one of these jewels must have at least 0.35 of physical attack damage leached as mana, and that's required, otherwise we'll run out of mana in long fights, or if we're spamming it against a boss. The full path of building will be available to you in the description below the video. On to the other links now, and the axe and shield are interchangeable unless we get the Surrenderer shield, in which case we want to double the power of our power attack, and therefore we want the gems I've got in the shield in the shield. In weapon 1 we have Leap Slam, faster attacks, and Fortify. This means that we want to jump on the heads of mobs as we come to attack them to make sure our Fortify buff is up all the time. In the shield we have Ancestral Warchief, Brutality, and Bloodlust. Brutality and Bloodlust don't just help Ancestral Warchief, they also help the counterattack on the Surrenderer's shield. In our Cast When Damage Taken setup in our helmet, we have Cast When Damage Taken linked to Molten Shell, Blood Rage, and Vulnerability. Basically, whenever we take a hit that takes us over the damage threshold, we'll proc Molten Shell, which gives us a massive defensive buff because we have it all the way up at level 20. We'll also keep Blood Rage up, which is important. I would have this separately, but I keep forgetting to manually cast it. So putting it here means it's pretty much always up. And then with Vulnerability, it basically curses any enemy that hits us hard enough and makes them much easier to kill because they take more physical damage and they bleed more. In the gloves, we have Corrupting Fever, Brutality, Efficiency, and Enduring Cry. If you don't have the Surrenderer shield, I would contemplate dropping Bloodlust, moving Enduring Cry into the shield, and then putting Deadly Ailments in the last slot of the gloves for much more Corrupting Blood damage. And then finally, in the boots, we have our auras, which are Blood and Sand, Pride, and Herald of Purity. Blood and Sand is always in Blood stance. These have reduced reservation due to the level 3 Enlighten that we have slotted, which allows us to run all 3 on the build. On to map mods now, and there's only 4 that I really avoid when running. One is of Congealment, which is the cannot leech life or mana from monsters. Second is Punishing, which reflects physical damage. You can run this one, but you'll need to be able to mitigate physical damage. I do have a video on Mitigate and Reflect, this will be shown in the description below. The next one is Impervious, which is monsters have a 50% chance to avoid poison, blind, and bleed. This will really lower our damage because we won't be able to get the full bleed stacks onto the monsters. And lastly, of Stasis. This is the players cannot regenerate life, mana, or energy shield. Technically we can run this one, but it's really inconvenient because Leap Slam will run out of mana and then we'll have to walk and it's really slow. Now that's not to say there are other ones that won't get you killed in tier 16. Temporal Chains is a real nightmare, as is lower recovery of life, mana, and energy shield. And also the negative resistances. So if the maps do have a lot of bad combinations, it's worth rolling some of those off. On to Pantheons now. Our Greater Pantheon, we use Soul Lunaris because it has great defensive capabilities. The Minor Pantheon is situational. I tend to switch this out as and when required by the map mods. However, most of the time I will be on Soul of Gruthcall because of its defensive capabilities. It gives you more damage reduction depending on how many monsters are hitting you, but also slows monster attack speed by 8% when they hit you. That's only if it's upgraded though, so do make sure your Pantheons are upgraded as soon as possible. On to the gear selection now, and we're going to talk about the axe first. The endgame axe really needs the role % to damage over time multiplier for bleeding inflicted with its weapon. These axes can be incredibly expensive, but there is some good news. There is a really budget version of this axe, which I've made a separate video on, which will be linked in the description below, and that is Jack the Axe. This really is an amazing budget axe. I picked one of these up for 20 chaos, but you can get a decent one for about 5 chaos. Priorities on your axe are physical damage, the damage over time multiplier for bleeding inflicted in this weapon, and you also want quality as high as possible to scale the fizz. Endgame axes that go to ridiculous levels of damage can be picked up for around 10 exalts. I picked one sort of mid-range for about 4x, which is shown on the right hand side of the screen. Onto the shield now, which is the second either really cheap or expensive piece of gear. For the budget version, you want to go for Lionized Remorse. This shield really is amazing for life and survivability. If you do have more money in your budget, then a Surrenderer shield is absolutely amazing for giving you life regen every time you block, which is all the time because we're at block cap. I really wouldn't go for a rare one here because you just can't beat Lionized Remorse or Surrenderer for their utility. For the belt, you really want a Ritlatha's Coil, though these are extremely expensive, starting at 6 Exalted Orbs. Luckily, I managed to drop one and then divined it to a decent one, but if you're not as lucky to drop one and you can't afford one, then a leather belt or a Stygian Vice, focusing on life and resistances, are absolutely fine as well. Onto the boots now, and the focus of the boots is life, movement speed, any resists that we're missing, and also any stats that we're missing. Some of the dexterity and intelligence on this build could be hard to get, so this is a great place to put them. Onto the chest, you want a chest with as much armour as possible. Ideally, it will be solely focused on armour. You also want as high a life roll as possible, and you want the craft that increases maximum life, and then fill any resistance holes, and you're all sorted. For the gloves, we go spiked gloves. This gives us increased melee damage. This doesn't affect the bleed, but does increase our attack substantially. And then on the gloves, we really want physical damage to attacks if we can get it. Any attributes we're missing, life and resistances. And the helmet is much the same. Life, resistances. Now for the enchantment on the helmet from the lab, there are several options. One is BladeStorm gives you 40% increased damage, but the one I went for, which was easier to get, was Enduring Cry has 30% increased cooldown recovery rate. This means that we can proc it a third faster each time, which really helps survivability no end. Onto the rings, ideally you'll have 2 steel rings with as much adds X to X physical damage to attacks as possible. Increased attack speed if we can get it, then resistances, life, and any stats that we're missing. You can see that both my rings are garbage, but I crafted them myself to keep the cost of the build down. And last but not least, we have the amulet. For my amulet, I chose an Onyx amulet. The real purpose of this amulet is to fix any attributes we're missing, get a boatload of life, and then any resistance holes that we may need to fill. Also, adds X to X physical damage to attacks would not go amiss and would be really, really useful on this amulet. For the anointment, there are 2 possible choices. One is really cheap, it's Splitting Strikes. This gives you 26% increased physical damage with axes, and ailments caused by those axes. It also gives us 6% increased attack speed with axes, +1 to melee strike range with axes, and overwhelms 12% of physical damage reduction. If you want a more defensive node, then Discipline and Training is probably for you, though this is a lot more expensive. It's a black and 2 silver oils. And now onto the flasks. Our first flask is a Sanctified Life flask. This is of Staunching, so we get the immunity to bleed or corrupted blood during flask effect, or removes any bleeding or corrupted blood as soon as the flask activates. Our next flask is Lionized Roar. This vastly increases our attack damage, doesn't touch our bleeding damage. Now some people want to avoid knockback flasks with bleed. I don't in this case, because the great thing about Bloodstance is you can put it in a triangle around the enemy and it just bounces them backwards and forwards between the blades. It's really quite amusing. Our third flask is a Quicksilver flask with Adrenaline, just to give us the speed when we need it. And then we have a Basalt flask for physical damage reduction, and a Quartz flask for 10% chance to dodge spells and attacks. One of those flasks should be a freeze immune flask, and the other flask should remove curses. Onto the Bandit selection now, and ultimately we want to help Eramir for the 2 extra passive points. However, if this is your league start, I would recommend helping Alira because the mana regen and the resistances will help you level very, very quickly without dying. And then as soon as we have fixed the resistances, we can switch over to the 2 passive points. I have a video on how to do this, it's in the description. In conclusion, this build is really, really strong. You can put it together on a budget, and I've actually really enjoyed playing it. I'm actually considering playing this for my next league start, providing it doesn't get nerfed. But I'm not 100% sure yet because I don't like playing the same character 2 leagues in a row. If you found this video useful, then please smash that like button. If you want to see more of my guides, then you can look here or here. And if you do try this build, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.